Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really powerful book, one that landed like a bombshell back in 1944, completely challenging the way people were thinking.
We're talking about The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek.
Exactly. And the context here is just crucial, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You have to picture it. 1944, the height of World War II. The Allies are fighting fascism, yes, but they're doing it using massive, centralized government planning.
Right, directing industry, rationing goods, the whole 9 yards.
And the prevailing view, the intellectual consensus really, was that this kind of planning wasn't just a wartime necessity. It was seen as, the future, more efficient, fairer, the path to a better post-war world.
People genuinely thought central planning was the progressive way forward. So when Hayek comes along,
he throws a huge spanner in the works. His argument was incredibly provocative for the time. He basically said, hold on, this road you think is paved with good intentions, social justice, economic organization, it's actually leading you somewhere you don't want to go.
Towards totalitarianism.
Precisely. He wasn't just saying planning was inefficient. He was saying it inevitably leads to the loss of freedom, that things like Nazism or Soviet communism weren't, some weird historical accidents or just right-wing plots.
He saw them as the logical conclusion.
The logical endpoint of adopting collectivist ideas in the first place. The moment you decide society's economic life should be centrally directed towards a single goal, you kickstart a process that demands coercion, that ultimately crushes liberty. It doesn't matter how nice the people starting it are.
Okay, so that's the core claim. Our job today, then, is to really unpack how he argues this happens, what's the mechanism, how does trying to plan for economic good, which sounds reasonable enough, end up destroying political and personal freedom.
Yeah, we need to trace that chain of logic. Why did Hayek believe so strongly that economic freedom wasn't just nice to have, but the absolute bedrock for everything else, and the lure of the great utopia?
So where does Hayek start building this case?
He starts by looking back, framing the whole situation as a kind of historical U-turn. He talks about this abandoned road, the path Western civilization had been on for, about 200 years before the 20th century?
The classical liberal direction.
Exactly. Freeing the individual from guilds, from state control over your job, freeing thought from dogma, letting people pursue their own economic interests under general laws.
And he acknowledges this worked, right?
Oh, absolutely. He credits this unchaining of individual energies, this spontaneous order, with producing an absolutely unprecedented explosion of science, wealth, technology, things people couldn't have even dreamed of before.
But then impatience sets in.
That's the twist. The very success created sky-high expectations. And the free market, well, it's not always smooth. It has bumps, periods of unemployment, adjustments. Progress wasn't always instantaneous.
So people started seeing the principles that caused the success competition, individual initiative, as obstacles.
Kind of like friction, yeah. Obstacles to even faster progress. And this bred this desire to, redesign everything, to have a complete remodeling of society based on some rational, conscious plan.
And intellectually, he saw a shift in who was setting the agenda.
Definitely. He points to the 60 years or so before he wrote the book, seeing this retreat of what he called English ideas, individual liberty, limited government, and the rise of German ideas.
Collectivism, organization, planning.
Right. Thinkers like Hegel, Marx, and then later figures like Sombart, Mannheim. Their ideas about the state needing to consciously direct society gained enormous traction. They became the new center of intellectual gravity, spreading out.
And this leads him to define his main target, collectivism. How does he pin that down? It sounds like a broad term.
It is, and the definition is key. He defines collectivism as the deliberate organization of all of society's resources and labor towards a definite unitary social goal.
Unitary, that's the important word there.
It really is. Socialism, for Hayek, is just one type of collectivism, usually aiming for equality or a specific distribution. But the method is the same, consciously directing everything toward one single agreed-upon end.
But doesn't socialism often promise more freedom? Freedom from want, freedom from exploitation.
That's the great irony, he points out, the great utopia, as he calls it. Modern socialists genuinely believe they were fighting for liberty. But Hayek goes back to the origins, to early socialist thinkers like St. Simon.
And what did he find there?
He found they were actually pretty authoritarian from the get-go. St. Simon, for instance, talked about needing a coercive spiritual power to run the system. He even predicted, quite chillingly, that people who didn't obey the planning boards would have to be, well, treated as cattle.
Wow, so the coercive element wasn't a later corruption, it was baked in.
Hayek argues it had to be. If you're really going to organize the whole of society, all its resources, towards one single purpose, well, that effort has to be total. It has to encompass everything.
Which makes it totalitarian in its very nature, even if it starts with democratic intentions.
That's his tragic conclusion. Democratic socialism, aiming for this unified plan, isn't just hard to achieve. He thinks it's fundamentally impossible. And the very attempt to achieve it forces you down a path towards coercion and control, creating something that the original idealists would likely abhor.
Okay, so one major argument Hayek had to counter back then was this idea that planning wasn't even really a choice anymore. It was just inevitable.
Right, the myth of technological necessity. You heard this a lot. Modern industry is so complex, mass production leads naturally to monopolies, competition is dying out anyway, so we have to have central coordination to manage it all.
It sounds plausible on the surface. Big factories, complex supply chains.
It does. But Hayek pushes back hard. He argues the rise of monopolies wasn't some unavoidable consequence of technology getting bigger. He saw it more as a result of specific government policies, tariffs, regulations, patents, and frankly, widely propagated opinions favoring concentration.
So he wasn't just making a theoretical point. He looked at the evidence.
He did. He pointed to things like the big studies done in the U.S. in the late 1930s by the Temporary National Economic Committee, the TNA. They were set up specifically to investigate economic concentration.
And what did they find?
They found surprisingly little evidence across most industries that giant firms were automatically more efficient just because of mass production. Often the monopolies that existed did so because of government protection, not because technology demanded it.
Okay, so the argument that technology forces us into central planning was shaky, according to Hayek.
He thought it was fundamentally flawed. And he flips the argument. The very complexity of modern life makes central planning less feasible, not more. Which brings us right to maybe the most famous Austrian economic idea, the knowledge problem.
Right. Why does complexity make the planner's job, as he put it, incredibly clumsy, primitive, and limited?
Because think about the sheer amount of information needed to run an economy efficiently. What do millions of consumers actually want? What are the local supply conditions for raw materials in thousands of different places? What production methods are currently the cheapest? This knowledge is
dispersed.
Totally dispersed. It exists in tiny fragments, scattered across millions of individual minds, specific to time and place. And crucially, it's constantly changing, day by day, hour by hour.
So no single person, no committee, no computer back then.
To possibly gather all that real-time, localized information, process it, and make a coherent, rational plan for the entire economy. Any central plan would have to rely on aggregated statistics, which are always out of date and miss the crucial details. It leads to enormous waste and misallocation.
So if the central planner can't do it, how does a complex society coordinate itself at all? How does anything get made or delivered?
Through the price system, operating within a competitive environment. This is Hayek's key mechanism. He called prices a kind of apparatus of registration or a communication system.
How does that work? Like a signal?
It's exactly like a signal. If, say, demand for tin suddenly goes up or a major tin mine floods, the price of tin rises. Millions of people, manufacturers using tin, consumers buying tin goods, don't need to know why the price went up. They don't need a government report.
They just react to the price change.
Instantly and automatically. Some will find ways to use less tin. Others will look for substitutes. Maybe some will try to produce more tin. The price coordinates all their actions decentrally without anyone needing to issue orders.
Just by knowing that one number, the price.
That's the genius of it for Hayek. It economizes on knowledge. Individuals only need local information and the relevant prices to make sensible decisions that fit into the larger pattern. He argues that our incredibly complex industrial system could never have developed if we'd relied on conscious central planning from the start. Spontaneous order achieves a level of complexity that planning can't even approach.
Okay, that makes sense. But still, you get people, often experts in their fields, arguing for planning. Why is that?
Ah, yes, the specialist trap. Hayek has this great insight. Often, the loudest calls for planning come from the frustrated specialist.
Meaning
Someone who is brilliant in their own narrow field and sees the messy compromises of the market, the budget constraints, the competing demands as irrational obstacles to achieving their own specific, important goal.
like the traffic engineer who just wants perfect, massive highways built now, regardless of the cost to neighborhoods or parks.
Exactly. Or the public health expert who thinks their priorities should override everything else. Or the scientist who believes their research is so vital it deserves unlimited funding. They see the market's checks and balances as, well, annoying interference.
They want their vision prioritized.
They do. But Hayek warns, imagine a world where we let the top expert in every field have their way completely unchecked. The road builders get all the roads they want, the environmentalists get all the wilderness they want, the standardization experts make everything uniform.
It would be chaos. An unbearable and irrational world, as he put it.
Totally contradictory and unbearable. The economist, Hayek says, isn't trying to impose another specialist vision. They're advocating for the competitive process itself, the mechanism that forces all these competing, valuable specialist goals to negotiate and coordinate with each other, without needing some impossible, all-knowing dictator to decide which one is best.
Okay, so if planning needs this single unitary goal, but a free society naturally has lots of different, often conflicting goals, how does democracy fit into this? Can a democracy actually do comprehensive planning?
This is where Hayek sees a fundamental incompatibility. A democratic parliament, say, might easily agree in principle. Yes, let's plan for the common good, or let's aim for general welfare. Fine words.
But they're vague.
Exactly. Real planning requires getting specific. It demands a complete hierarchy of ends, a detailed moral code that tells you in every single instance of conflict what gets priority. Should we use steel for tanks or tractors? Higher wages for nurses or more hospital beds? Less pollution or cheaper electricity?
And that level of detailed agreement just doesn't exist in a diverse society.
It can't exist. People have fundamentally different values and priorities. So the Democratic Assembly gets stuck. They can agree on the idea of planning, but they can't agree on the thousands of specific, contentious choices the plan requires.
And you can't just break the plan down and vote on bits of it, can you?
No, because a comprehensive economic plan is like a machine. All the parts have to fit together. Changing one allocation here affects everything else over there. It needs a single, coherent vision. You can't build it through piecemeal compromise and log rolling.
So what happens when the democracy realizes it can't agree on the specifics?
Dissatisfaction grows. People start complaining about parliaments being just talking shops, unable to get anything done. The democratic process itself starts to look inefficient and gridlocked.
Which creates an opening for
The call to delegate power. Let's hand this over to the experts, or to permanent officials or independent commissions. The justification is usually framed as, oh, this is too technical for politicians.
But Hayek says that's not the real reason.
He argues the technical complexity is often just an excuse. The real reason for delegation is the political impossibility of getting agreement on all those competing interests and values within the democratic body itself.
And what happens when power is delegated to these experts?
They are no longer just administrators carrying out a law. They are now forced to make the fundamental choices between ends that the politicians couldn't agree on. They have to decide who gets what.
So they have to impose their own values, their own priorities on the community.
They inevitably must. And because the whole point of the plan is to achieve specific foreseen results, hitting production targets, allocating resources precisely, they cannot be impartial, like a judge applying a general law. They have to discriminate. They have to pick winners and losers to make the plan work.
This sounds like it's moving pretty far from democratic control, even if elections are still held.
It's the gutting of democracy from the inside. Hayek sees this process leading towards what he called a plebiscitarian dictatorship. You might still have a leader confirmed by popular vote, maybe even enthusiastically, but that leader needs near absolute power to enforce the coherent plan when genuine consensus on the details is impossible.
So, in practice, the plan reflects the will of a small group.
Yes. To get anything done, the detailed, coherent plan devised by a relatively small group, the planners, the party elite, whoever can actually agree amongst themselves, has to be imposed on the majority who remain divided. The sheer practical necessity of making the plan function, Hayek argues, forces a single will to override the messy diversity of democratic opinion.
That's a really stark warning. He's saying even socialists who want democracy, if they pursue comprehensive planning, will unintentionally end up creating an authoritarian system. People might argue he's too pessimistic about compromise.
His point isn't really about whether people want to compromise. It's about the object of the compromise. You can compromise on a general rule, like a tax rate, maybe we meet in the middle, but you can't really compromise on the intricate details of a fully integrated national economic plan.
Why not?
Because changing one part, say, deciding to produce more shoes, throws off the plan for leather, for factory allocation, for transport, for labor in other sectors. It's a tightly interwoven system. You either accept the whole plan, more or less, or you reject it. You can't effectively hash out every single detail through democratic bargaining. That technical need for internal coherence is what, in his view, ultimately kills democratic deliberation about the plan itself.
Okay, so this shift from democratic haggling to expert command has huge implications for how government itself operates. Hayek puts enormous emphasis on the rule of law. What exactly does he mean by that, and why is it so central to his argument?
The rule of law is, for Hayek, maybe the defining feature of a genuinely free country. And he's very specific. He means the government can only use its coercive power according to formal law.
Formal law.
Meaning general, abstract rules that are fixed and announced beforehand. They apply equally to everyone, or at least to broad categories of people, defined impersonally. The key is predictability. You should be able to know the rules of the game in advance and plan your own life accordingly, knowing how the state will act in certain circumstances.
He used that analogy of the rule of the road, right?
It's a great analogy. The rule of the road, drive on this side, stop at red lights, don't exceed this speed, is a perfect example of formal law. It's general, it's predictable.
And the government setting the rule doesn't know or care why I'm driving my car today.
Exactly. The law is instrumental. It helps people achieve their own, unknown, diverse purposes. The legislator is impartial because the specific effects on specific individuals and their plans are unforeseen and irrelevant to the purpose of the rule itself.
Okay, so that's formal law under the rule of law. How does central planning contrast with that?
Central planning requires the opposite, substantive law. Because the whole point of the plan is to achieve specific, concrete, foreseen social outcomes, a certain distribution of income, a certain level of steel output, a particular vision of the good society.
The government has to care about the specific effects on specific people.
It absolutely must. To make the plan work, the planning authority has to foresee and intend the specific consequences for particular firms, industries, and individuals. Therefore, it cannot be impartial. It must take sides. It has to impose its specific values and priorities.
So the moment you start aiming for specific outcomes rather than just setting general rules, you abandon impartiality.
You have to. Planning is deliberate discrimination. The authority needs discretion. It needs to make decisions based on what seems fair or reasonable or necessary for the plan in a particular case. Should this factory get the scarce raw materials, or that one? Should this group of workers be moved here or stay there?
That sounds like arbitrary decision-making, not predictable law.
It's the return to arbitrary rule, Hayek says. Instead of knowing the general rule in advance, your fate depends on the specific, discretionary judgment of an official about what's best for the plan at that moment. He calls it a return to the rule of status. Your position depends on what the authorities think of you and your utility, not on general rights.
And this uncertainty must wreck things like contracts and property rights.
Completely undermines them. If the planning authority can just override your contract or tell you what you must do with your property because the plan requires it or it serves the common good, then those legal concepts lose their meaning as stable, predictable frameworks for action. They become subject to the planner's will.
What happens to the courts and the legal system in this scenario? Do they just disappear?
Not necessarily disappear, but their function changes dramatically. They might evolve simply to legitimize the arbitrary actions of the planning authority. You might pass a law that says the planning board has the power to do whatever it deems necessary to fulfill the plan.
So legally, whatever the board does is legal?
Juridically, yes. The board's actions are authorized by law. But Hayek forcefully argues this is the opposite of the rule of law. It's using the form of law to destroy its substance. Giving unlimited discretionary power to an authority, even one initially set up by a democracy, creates the potential for absolute despotism.
And under such a system, what happens to individual rights we normally take for granted, like freedom of speech or movement?
They become essentially meaningless, even if they're still technically on the books. What good is freedom of the press if the state controls all the paper mills, the printing presses, the distribution networks, and the advertising revenue through its economic plan?
You can say what you like, but no one will hear you.
Pretty much. What good is freedom of occupation if the state decides where industries are located, who gets trained for what job, and what everyone's income is? The state controls all the means necessary to exercise those freedoms. Hayek believed these rights would inevitably clash with the requirements of the plan, forcing the planners to curtail or suppress them in practice.
This leads directly to one of Hayek's most stark claims. Economic control is life control.
It's a crucial link. Once the state controls the means of production, prices, wages, and allocation of resources, it effectively controls the entire material basis of everyone's life. Where you live, what job you do, what you can buy, your entire lifestyle, it all falls under the planner's purview. There's no independent economic sphere to retreat into.
And often the justification for grabbing this control is the promise of security, right? People want stability.
Security is a powerful motivator, but Hayek insists we have to be really careful about what kind of security we're talking about. He makes a vital distinction, similar to the one with law.
Okay, what's the distinction?
First, there's minimum security, what we might call a social safety net, protection against severe physical hardship, ensuring basic food, shelter, healthcare, providing social insurance against risks like illness, accidents, maybe unemployment for a period. Hayek thought a wealthy society absolutely could and should provide this. It's compatible with freedom.
But there's another kind of security.
Yes. The second kind is the security of a particular income or status. This means protecting specific individuals or groups from the normal ups and downs, the income fluctuations, the job displacements that happen constantly in a dynamic competitive economy.
Like guaranteeing a farmer a certain price for his crop, or protecting a specific industry from foreign competition?
Exactly. Or guaranteeing a worker their current job at their current wage, even if demand shifts or technology changes. Hayek argues this kind of security is fundamentally irreconcilable with freedom of choice, particularly freedom of occupation.
Because if you guarantee my job, someone else can't choose to compete for it, or the economy can't adapt.
Precisely. To guarantee that security, you have to suppress competition, you have to control entry into professions, you have to dictate wages and prices, you essentially have to command the economic adjustments that would otherwise happen through free choices and price signals. The state have to order people where to work and what to produce.
And trying to provide this security piece by piece doesn't really work either.
No, he argues it actually makes things worse overall. If you give special protection and guaranteed income to one group, say a well-organized union or industry lobby, you don't increase overall security. You just make everyone else more insecure because they have to bear the costs and the lack of flexibility.
So security becomes a privilege, something granted by the state, not something earned through adaptability.
It becomes a mark of status, highly sought after. And people become willing to trade their independence, their liberty, for the state-guaranteed security. Hayek quotes Benjamin Franklin here, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. This shift in values prioritizing security over freedom paves the way for something even darker.
Which is?
Chapter 10, Why the Worst Old to Get on Top. This is maybe the most chilling part of the book.
Why does he think collectivist systems inevitably end up being run by the ruthless, not the idealists who might have started them?
Because the nature of the system changes the criteria for success. In a centralized state where power is concentrated, getting things done relies less on persuading people and more on exercising control and ultimately applying force. The system starts to select for individuals who are willing to do the unpleasant things required to enforce the central plan.
He outlines specific reasons, doesn't he? 3 negative principles of selection.
Yes. First, uniformity. He argues that the more intelligent and educated people are, the more diverse their views become. So, if you need a large, cohesive group, a mass movement, or a dominant party capable of imposing a single plan, you're more likely to find agreement among those with, frankly, lower moral and intellectual standards. It's easier to unite people around simpler, more primitive instincts and prejudices, the lowest common denominator.
Okay, that's pretty bleak. What's the second?
Docility and gullibility. The leader, or the ruling group, needs followers who are easily swayed, who don't have strong, independent convictions. People whose vague ideas can be easily shaped by propaganda, who respond readily to emotional appeals and a ready-made system of values handed down from above.
And the third principle taps into something quite dark in human nature.
the power of the negative program. Hayek observes it's always easier to get people to agree on hating something, an enemy group, the capitalists, the foreigners, the Jews,
Right.
or simply envy of those better off, than it is to get them to agree on a complex, positive plan of action. This us versus them mentality is a powerful tool for forging unity in a collectivist state.
So these three factors combine to favor those who are unscrupulous.
Yes. Because to make the central plan work, especially when it inevitably runs into problems or opposition, someone has to be willing to break moral rules. Someone has to suppress dissent, override rights, perhaps imprison or eliminate opponents, all justified by the good of the whole or the necessity of the plan. The ruthless are willing to do what the decent are not.
And this moral decay at the top then infects the whole system, leading to what he calls the end of truth.
It has to. If the system relies on a single plan imposed by authority, it can't tolerate independent thought or inconvenient facts that challenge the plan or the planner's wisdom.
So propaganda becomes essential.
Absolutely essential. And not just propaganda about values, our system is good, but propaganda about facts. The state needs to justify its decisions, rationalize its failures, and ensure people believe in the necessity and success of the plan, even when reality contradicts it. Official myths must be created and enforced.
Everything the government does has to be portrayed as correct and beneficial.
It has to become sacrosanct and exempt from criticism. The sole criterion for deciding whether information should be released becomes its likely effect on popular loyalty. Will this news strengthen support for the regime or weaken it? Truth becomes entirely secondary.
And this control extends everywhere, even science and art.
Hayek gives chilling examples from the totalitarian states of his time. Talk of needing a party line in mathematics or condemning Einstein's physics as Jewish science. The idea of pursuing science for science's sake or art for art's sake becomes intolerable because everything must serve the collective purpose defined by the state.
So the very meaning of truth changes.
It stops being something objective, something discovered through individual conscience or free inquiry. Truth becomes whatever the authority says it is, whatever serves the plan. That's the ultimate intellectual suffocation.
One of the most controversial parts of Hayek's argument, especially then, must have been his direct linking of socialism and Nazism. People saw them as polar opposites.
They did, and he knew it was provocative. But he insisted the connection wasn't superficial or accidental. He pointed out that many fascist leaders, Mussolini, Laval in France, Quisling in Norway, actually started their careers as socialists.
But his argument went deeper than just personnel, right? It was about the ideas.
He was about the shared method, collectivism. Both movements rejected individualism and liberalism. Both advocated for the unified, state-directed organization of society and the economy towards a single overriding goal. The main difference was the nature of that goal, international proletarian solidarity for the socialists versus national or racial supremacy for the fascists and Nazis. But the total state control was the same.
And he found German thinkers who actually saw this connection themselves.
Yes, particularly during World War I. He highlights figures like Paul Lynch, who was initially a Marxist socialist but became a fervent nationalist. Lynch explicitly framed the war against Britain as a conflict between the ideas of 1789, liberty, individualism, free markets, the English way, and the ideas of 1914.
Which represented
Organization, community, duty, discipline, the German way, which Lynch explicitly equated with socialism. He argued that Germany, with its history of state intervention and industrial cartels fostered by Bismarck, was actually the more advanced, more socialist, and more efficient system destined to supersede the messy liberalism of Britain and France.
So some German socialists saw themselves as fulfilling a historical destiny towards organized collectivism and saw the war as part of that struggle.
Precisely. For Hayek, this wasn't just nationalist rhetoric. It revealed the underlying philosophical kinship. The real battle line wasn't left versus right in the traditional sense, but between the entire collectivist approach, whether nationalist or socialist, and the classical liberal ideal of individual freedom operating under general laws. If you adopt the collectivist method, you are on the same road, regardless of your starting ideology.
And this leads to his final profound point about what happens to individual morality in such a system.
If the state directs everything, if your life is planned for you, where is the space for genuine moral action? Hayek argues that morality fundamentally requires choice. It only really exists when an individual is free to decide for themselves, to weigh competing values, and perhaps voluntarily sacrifice their own advantage for a moral principle.
But if the state just tells you what to do for the common good,
You're just being obedient. You're not exercising moral judgment. a system that promises to relieve individuals of the burden of choice, the risks of competition, the responsibility for their own fate. A system that offers security in exchange for obedience can't help but be, as he puts it, anti-moral in its effect.
It undermines the very virtues that make a free society function.
Exactly. Things like independence, self-reliance, initiative, willingness to take risks, respecting the rights of others even when it's inconvenient. These individual virtues are cultivated by freedom and responsibility. Collectivism replaces them with the need to conform, to obey, to fit into the plan. It creates a moral void filled only by state command.
So Hayek's ultimate message isn't just an economic argument, it's a moral one about the price of freedom.
It absolutely is. He's forcing us to confront that liberty isn't easy or comfortable. It involves uncertainty, risk, and requires us to accept outcomes we might not like. We have to be willing to make material sacrifices to tolerate a degree of insecurity if we want to preserve the freedom that makes moral life, innovation, and human dignity possible. That Franklin quote really sums it up. Trading essential liberty for temporary safety ultimately gets you neither. So if we boil down Hayek's core mechanism, his warning, it's this. You start with the desire to centrally plan the economy for some notion of good, but this demands a single, unified hierarchy of ends. Since free people will never fully agree on such a detailed hierarchy, democratic consensus fails.
Leading to delegation.
Delegation of power to experts or authorities who can make the decisions. But to implement the plan, they must abandon impartial, predictable formal law and resort to arbitrary, discretionary commands.
Taking sides, picking winners.
Exactly. And this environment, where control is key, tends to select for the ruthless those willing to use coercion, which in turn requires suppressing dissent and controlling information, leading to the end of truth. It's a chain reaction where economic planning corrodes the foundations of political liberty and individual morality.
A sobering sequence. So, for you, our listener, Hayek saw modern society trying to consciously direct everything, replacing the impersonal and anonymous mechanism of the market. Take a moment and think. What's something valuable, maybe unexpected, that emerged in your own life recently, not because it was planned by some authority, but precisely because of spontaneous, undirected actions and interactions? Maybe a new friendship, a business opportunity, a creative idea, something that couldn't have been centrally designed.
And if those kinds of beneficial surprises rely on a degree of freedom and unpredictability, Hayek forces us to ask, how much personal risk, how much uncertainty are you really willing to tolerate today to keep that space for spontaneous possibility open, not just for yourself, but for everyone? It's a tough question. Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.